Welcome to the podcast, Tis But a Scratch, fact and fiction about the Middle Ages. And today we are going to complete our story of the Norman Conquest. And again, I have as my co-host, my delightful co-host, Dr. Jenny Paxton from the Catholic University of America. Jenny?
I'm really glad to be back.
We left off last episode with the death of King Edward the Confessor of England and the claims to the throne of the three main rivals for succession, Earl Harald Godwinson, King Harald Hardrada of Norway, and Duke William the Bastard of Normandy. Unsurprisingly, the English magnates and prelates who constituted the Royal Council elected one of their own rather than a foreigner, even though Harold's only claim to kinship with Edward was as his brother-in-law. But the precedents of the Danish kings Canute, Harald Harefoot, and Harthacnut had shattered traditional notions of throne-worthiness based on blood descent from Alfred the Great that had once governed elections of kings of England. Harold's election was immediately challenged by the two rival claimants, both of whom gathered fleets and armies to take the throne by force. Duke William not only prepared militarily, but because he wanted to be viewed as a legitimate king rather than merely as a conqueror, he sought the approval of the papacy for his endeavor. The winning argument was that as a guest of Duke William, and I use the term guest very loosely, Earl Harald had sworn an oath on holy relics to support the Norman Duke's succession. Jenny, why don't you take it from here?
After Hastings, Harold's forswearing of a sacred oath was seen as the sin for which he suffered the divine punishment of defeat.
Right.
As Harold's biographer Ian Walker points out, quote, "This was an argument typical of the period, when disaster and downfall were seen as God's punishment for sin. It was based on the deep-rooted belief that God was responsible for all that happened in the world, and that everything that occurred represented the rewards of virtue or punishment for sin, rather than the results of chance or human action."
Yeah, and the fact that there was a comet in the sky at the time of the election of Harald seems to have been confirming this idea that this was a sinful, bad thing that was happening.
And the comet is for sure in the Bayeux Tapestry.
And it's in the Bayeux Tapestry. So modern historians, of course, really don't go for divine punishments and divine favors as explanations for historical causality. We tend to go for non-supernatural explanations, and so that's what we're going to go for here. William may well have believed that papal backing would bring him divine favor for his chancy enterprise, but in more secular terms, he knew that it would help him persuade the Norman barons to give their support, and perhaps hope that it would undermine the resolve of Harold and his English supporters. So we've left with the death of Edward the Confessor, and now we're really going to get to the conquest itself. We're going to get to why William became the conqueror rather than simply Duke William the Bastard.
So to recap, these are our three claimants. 2 Harolds and a William. Let's go back to Harald Godwinson, now on the throne as Harald II. Harald had a big problem, in addition to the fact that the Pope thought him to be a usurper. Big problem was his own brother Tostig. You will remember that in the previous year, Tostig had been driven into exile when his subjects in the Northumbrian earldom had rebelled. Harald at the time had refused to support his brother. Tostig had gone off to lick his wounds with his in-laws in Flanders. Tostig had then had to stand by and watch from across the English Channel while his brother seized the throne of England, which must have infuriated Tostig even more, and he determined to cause trouble for Harald. Initially, Tostig prevailed on his father-in-law, Count Baldwin, to provide him with a fleet to ravage the coastal regions of England.
In other words, Tostig went a Viking, much as Harald had done back in 1051.
We should just pause for a second to say that this was a totally standard MO.
It really is.
You harassed or harried or ravaged your opponent's lands because that would deplete their productive capacity.
And would give you wealth.
Absolutely. It was literally a zero-sum game.
Yep, it really was.
So, this was only making him a nuisance and not really coming out to be a threat to his brother. So Tostig approached King of Norway, Harald Hardrada, and said, "Hey, remember that claim to England you had? Well, I'll help you make good on it."
So much for brotherly love. Anyway, King Harald Godwinson was certainly aware of the growing threat from Norway because news travels fairly quickly on the northern sea lanes, but he also knew that trouble was brewing to the south as well. By the summer of 1066, it was well known throughout Western Christendom that Duke William of Normandy was planning to invade England. It simply was not possible to keep such a huge project a secret.
For example, word undoubtedly filtered back to England of the hundreds of ships that William was having built in the spring and summer of 1066. The most splendid of these was the gift of his beloved Duchess Matilda. This is his flagship, Mora. The best estimates that we have of the size of William's force rate it at about 6,000 to 8,000 men, of whom maybe 1,000 to 2,000 were horsemen. And for this period, that is a simply enormous army.
Yeah, I agree. And that's really our best guess at what the size of William's army was. And in order to get there, we have to ignore all the medieval sources. Medieval chroniclers are notoriously unreliable when it comes to numbers. The Carmen de Hastingi Pro Elio, the song of the Battle of Hastings, a poem that may have been written shortly after the battle, tells us that Duke William led an army of 150,000 men and faced an English army of 1.2 million. Yes, million.
There's not almost... that's maybe at least half the people in England at the time.
Close to it, yeah. Master Wass, writing in the 1170s, places the English force at a mere 400,000.
More realistic.
William of Poitiers, who served Duke William first as a soldier and later as a chaplain, is only slightly more credible. He praises William for providing supplies at his own expense for 50,000 men-at-arms during the month-long stay in their camp at Dives. The number swells to 60,000 in his account of the battle. Only one modern historian that I know of, M.K. Lawson, takes any of this seriously. Lawson, in his book on Hastings, writes that each side may have had tens of thousands of men and even entertains the possibility of William of Poitiers' French army of 60,000. Lawson's argument strikes me as implausible on logistical grounds.
I agree, but I think you need to explain that.
Okay. I'm basing this on the calculations of Jenny and my late friend and colleague, Bernard Bachrach. Bertie was the most prominent advocate for the capacity of early medieval states to raise and maintain large armies. And even he couldn't imagine William assembling an army larger than 14,000 people. When I say 14,000, I mean non-combatants as well as combatants. And this army, he would think, could only have had 2,000 to 3,000 war horses. The limitation is logistical. The often ignored third leg of the military historian's tripod of strategy, tactics, and logistics. We know that William's army was encamped for a month at Dives-sur-Mer, waiting for favorable winds to cross the channel. Bachrach estimated that an army of this size would have required 28 tons of unmilled grain and 14,000 gallons of fresh water every single day if each man had a ration of 4 pounds of grain and 1 gallon of water. Now, that assumes that the men ate only cold wheat gruel day and day out and drank only water. William's 2,000 to 3,000 war horses would have required a minimum daily ration of 14 to 20 tons of either oats or barley and a similar amount of hay. For Bachrach, these figures constitute evidence of the, as he put it, the great resources in both wealth and organization that Duke William had at his disposal, which most historians have failed to appreciate.
So how do we get to that 7,000 to 8,000 estimate?
the way that I really like. It's just simply a guess. And it's a guess based upon what we've identified as the battlefield, the ridge upon which the English deployed, and the manner in which we believe that they fought. The most that could have been up there is 8,000 men. And that's pretty much how you get it.
Mm-hmm. So King Harald is then caught between a rock and a Hardrada place.
Yeah, okay. We need to have Ellen here to groan at that.
I'm sorry.
That's worthy of me.
I guess I would say sorry, not sorry.
Ah.
King Harald was more afraid of William with his huge army than he was of Harald Hardrada, so the king assembled his forces on the southern coast of England to meet that invasion. He had to pick his foes, and he wanted to face the more dangerous one. However, contrary winds bottled up William's fleet across the Channel for week after frustrating week, and you can imagine what this must have been like for both William and Harald. William is eager to get going before the weather turned bad for the year. Harald wants to get the ordeal over with as soon as possible.
Yeah. Again, we need to consider logistics. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states that when he learned of William's intentions, King Harald gathered at Sandwich, quote, a greater fleet and army than any king in this land had ever assembled, end quote. In theory, an English king could raise an army for royal expeditions, and royal expeditions were called fyrds. They could raise an army of 14,000 men obligated to serve at their own expense for 60 days, and perhaps even a greater force for defense of the realm. This does not include the king's housecarls, his military household, which may have numbered 2,000 to 3,000 professionally trained soldiers. I should pause a moment to explain how I got my estimate of 14,000 fyrdsmen. It's actually based on a simple calculation. Military service in England in 1066 was, in fact, a land tax. When summoned by the king for a military expedition, landholders were obligated to send one soldier from every 5 hides of land. The hide was a unit of taxation. It was a notional 120 acres, but the actual acreage of a hide varied according to the land's productivity. It's more precise to think of a hide as the amount of land capable of rendering approximately £1 a year in revenue for its owner. The total hideage of England in 1066 was 70,000 hides. 70,000 divided by 5 is 14,000. At this point, I can imagine some of my colleagues in Doomsday Book studies shaking their heads and saying, Richard, you know better than that. Jenny isn't only because she is far too polite. And they are right. Not all English counties were assessed in hides in 1066. Most of the counties in the Danelaw used the carucate, the ploughland, as their unit of taxation, and Kent was unique in being assessed in sulungs. To obtain the figure of 70,000, I basically treated all these units of taxation as equivalent, and the 5-hide rule is explicitly stated only in a custom recorded in the Domesday Book Survey of Berkshire. There's reason to believe that it was applied more generally than in a single shire, but there's also reason to believe that in the Danelaw, the rule was 1 soldier from every 6 carucates. But the figure of 14,000 strikes me as at least in the ballpark. The English military recruitment system is a reminder of the precocious character of the Anglo-Saxon state. Duke William, in contrast, had to rely on his barons and on mercenaries. But the Anglo-Saxon military recruitment system is also a reminder that administrative sophistication does not necessarily translate into military effectiveness. It's certain that Harald did not have 17,000 troops encamped at Sandwich. Half that number is far more likely. I base that not only on the logistical challenge of keeping an army that large supplied in one place for 2 months, but on the fact that Harald was facing not 1, but 2 invasions. As he watched and waited in the south for William to invade, in the north, Earls Morcar and Edwin were guarding Northumbria and Mercia against Tostig's raiding and the threat of Hardrada. Harald kept his great fleet in port at Sandwich throughout the summer and into the autumn of 1066 in preparation for an invasion from Normandy. But he had to dismiss them on the 8th of September when their provisions along with their 60 days of required military service ran out. When that happened, Harold's military force was reduced almost exclusively to his personal military retainers, his housecarls. They were admittedly by far his most effective fighters, but they were too few in number to turn back full-scale invasion from Normandy.
Just after Harald had dismissed some of his soldiers, he got word that the King of Norway, the other Harald, together with his own brother Tostig, had invaded Yorkshire in the north of England. So now King Harald is at the wrong end of England to meet the threat. Now, the choice of Yorkshire is doubtless no accident. York had been the center of a Viking kingdom in the 10th century, and there was still substantial sympathy in that part of England for the Scandinavian cause. In fact, Harald Hardrada and Tostig did score a significant success right away. The Northern English army, under the two earls, Edwin and Morcar, tried to meet the invading force at Fulford Gate on September 20th and were soundly defeated. The invasion in Yorkshire was thus a genuine emergency, and King Harald raced north to meet the threat, gathering an army as he went and covering a tremendous amount of ground in very short order. And on September 25th, just 5 days after the Battle of Fulford Gate, King Harald faced the combined forces of Harald Hardrada and Tostig at Stamford Bridge. Harald defeated the invaders decisively. Both the King of Norway and Tostig were killed in the battle. So one of the serious threats facing King Harald has been dealt with.
I should emphasize how impressive Harold's victory in the Battle of Stamford Bridge was. It was literally the stuff of sagas. The early 13th century Icelandic historian and saga writer Snorri Sturluson relates that before the two sides engaged, 20 English horsemen, all fully armored, rode out to the center of the Norwegian shield wall. One of them then called out, "Is Earl Tostig in this army?" Tostig, with Hardrada at his side, came forward. The rider, who never gave his name, then made the Earl an offer. If he would join with his brother against Hardrada, Harold would give him all of Northumberland and even a third of his kingdom. Tostig responded that offer was far more generous than the contempt and hostility he had been shown the previous winter, and if it had been made then, he would gladly have accepted it. He then asked, "What will Harald offer King Harald Sigurðarson?" Hardrada was only a nickname. "What will he offer the king for his pains?" The rider replied, 7 feet of English ground, or so much more as he is taller than other men. Tostig replied that the horsemen should ride back and prepare for battle, adding that Norwegians will never have to say that Earl Tostig abandoned their king to join his enemies. Hardrada was impressed by the boldness of the rider and asked Tostig if he knew who he was. Tostig replied, "Yes, that was Harald, son of Godwin." It's a great story, and it may even have a kernel of truth in it. The usually reliable Anglo-Norman historian Henry of Huntington, writing around 1130, has a similar story, though the offer to Hardrada in it is only 6 feet of English soil, and more if necessary given how tall he is. The one part of the story that I don't doubt is that Hardrada was impressed with Harold Godwinson's boldness. That Harold's response to news of the English defeat was to engage the victorious Norwegian army in battle after a 200-mile forced march shows that he was in fact bold and willing to take risks. Harald Hardrada was, as we said, a legendary figure in his own lifetime. His Scandinavian forces had just destroyed the English army of the north. I would add to this that in terms of military experience, Hardrada's army was combat-hardened. The English were not. I think the latter hasn't been sufficiently appreciated by historians. Harold himself had led a successful campaign against the Welsh, but between Canute's succession in 1016 and 1066, England, outside of the northern and the Welsh marches, was at peace. The Anglo-Danish elite was a military aristocracy, but one that was largely a matter of self-image. and practical experience. Some of Earl Morcar of Northumbria's housecarls may have had battle experience under his and Tostig's predecessor, Earl Siward. In the summer of 1054, Earl Siward invaded Scotland to depose its king, Mac Bethad Mac Finlach, better known as Macbeth. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes the invasion, which was made famous later by Shakespeare. Quote, "At this time Earl Siward went with a great army into Scotland with both fleet and a land force, and fought against the Scots, and put to flight the king Macbeth, and slew all that was best in the land, and brought thence much war spoil, such as no man obtained before." The Chronicle adds, "And there were slain his son Osbeorn and his sister's son Siward, and some of his housecarls, and also of the king's." Over the 12 years following Siward's military expedition into Scotland, Northumbria was at peace. For most of the English army at Fulford Gate, this would have been their first taste of battle. There is some archaeological evidence to support that. In the medieval cemetery at St. Andrew's Church, Fishergate, York, archaeologists have identified the skeletons of 12 adult males buried together in a group, all of whom died from wounds made by swords, axes, or spears. Given that the skeletons have been carbon dated to the mid to late 11th century, the logical inference is that these were local men who fell in the Battle of Fulford Gate. What is telling is that none of the bodies showed evidence of any earlier battle wounds. Despite this, the sources say that Fulford Gate was a hard-fought battle in which many of the invaders fell. Harold Godwinson's forces at Stamford Bridge was similar in composition to Morcar's and Edwin's at Fulford Gate. The military households of both the commanders provided the professional core of their armies. The main difference was that Harold's housecarls had considerable recent military experience. 3 years earlier, Harald, then Earl of Wessex and Earl of Herefordshire, had led a series of successful campaigns against Griffith ap Llewellyn of Gwynedd, King of Wales. But the rank and file of Harold's army at Stamford Bridge, most of whom came from the southern shires and the eastern Midlands, would have had no more battle experience than Morcar and Edwin's Ferdinand had. So, to what should we attribute Harold's victory? I think it probably had a lot to do with the element of surprise. Harold's forced march was a gamble that paid off. The battering that Hardrada's forces had taken at Fulford Gate also shouldn't be dismissed.
Yes, we definitely have reports that they were essentially still recovering from that victory.
Yes.
But 2 days later, the winds in the English Channel shifted. So this is William's second big stroke of luck after the whole English political instability thing.
Actually, it was his third big stroke of luck. As we said in the previous episode, William's entire tenure as Duke of Normandy had been spent fighting to preserve his rule. He faced several major revolts by unruly Norman vassals and waged war with the Count of Anjou over disputed territory and control over the county of Maine. The King of France, Henry I, provided critical military support in his struggle against the rebels, but that alliance lasted only as long as William was weak. The 11th century Capetian kings of France were, at the most, the first among equals. They were always guarding against any duke or count gaining enough power to challenge them. When Duke William consolidated his control over Normandy and formed a marriage alliance with the powerful Count of Flanders, Henry I began to view him as a possible threat. To check William's power, the king encouraged Count Geoffrey of Anjou to invade Normandy. William turned back that invasion, but it was a close thing. Now comes the second stroke of luck. In 1060, both Count Geoffrey Martel of Anjou and King Henry I of France died. Count Geoffrey's heir, his nephew Geoffrey the Bearded, proved to be so incompetent politically and militarily that he alienated the entire Angevin nobility and managed to get himself excommunicated by the Archbishop of Tours. Finally, Geoffrey's extremely competent brother, Fulk le Rachin, Fulk the Surly, rose up in revolt, defeated his brother in battle, and imprisoned him for the rest of his life. but that didn't happen until 1068, 2 years after the Battle of Hastings. Meanwhile, King Henry I's successor, Philip I, was only a child of 8 when his father died. These two timely deaths freed William to pursue the English throne.
This favorable change in the winds led one historian to quip that William should be called not William the Bastard, but William the Lucky Bastard.
Yeah.
The reason he was lucky is that if the winds had allowed him to cross the channel sooner when he planned, he would have faced Harold Godwinson on the south coast with his army fully intact.
And
instead, Harold was at the other end of England. But when William set out for England, he may not have known which Harold he would fight when he got there, Harold Godwinson or Harold Hardrada.
Some historians are reluctant to attribute this to luck. They propose that William was not kept in port by unfavorable winds, but was waiting for Harold's fleet to disband before sailing across the channel. This has been argued by two old friends and colleagues that I really admire, the late Carol Kilmore and John Gillingham. It's certainly a possible explanation. There's evidence that both Harold and William used scouting vessels to keep tabs on the enemy fleets. On the other hand, Christine and Gerald Grange, who are experienced sailors as well as historians, make a compelling argument for the unfavorable wind interpretation based on nautical and navigational constraints faced by medieval mariners attempting to cross the channel in an unusually wet and windy summer. That seems to have been the case in 1066. The Grange's practical historical argument has the virtue of being in line with the primary sources. William of Poitiers, a chaplain and former soldier who knew how to suck up to his patron, likened Duke William's military acuity to Julius Caesar's. If he knew that William was craftily outweighting his enemy, I'm sure he would have trumpeted. Instead, he, like the other Norman sources, says that unfavorable winds kept William's fleet in port. Crossing the English Channel wouldn't seem to be so great a nautical challenge. It isn't today, but given the ship types available to Duke William, it was a dangerous enterprise, especially in heavy weather. William's first attempt to cross the channel proved to be a failure. He sailed out of Dives on September 13th, only to have the wind suddenly change on him, blowing the fleet north along the dangerous Normandy coast until it found safe harbor at St. Valery. He was stuck in that port by unfavorable weather for another 2 weeks. And when he was finally able to set sail again on September 28th, his fleet almost didn't make it across. The story of the crossing is very dramatic. The fleet was sailing under cover of darkness, but the Duke wanted to make sure that the ships didn't arrive on an unknown shore before daybreak. So he told his captains to anchor off the coast and watch for a lantern that he would display on his flagship, the Mora. When they saw the lantern, they should proceed. However, the ships became separated during the crossing when fog rolled in, and William's shipmates were panicking because it seemed as if they were all alone on the sea. However, the Duke rallied them, and then one by one, as the dawn broke, the masts of all the other ships in the huge invasion fleet came into view until all the masts together looked like a forest of trees on the water. Maybe the story has been improved upon in retelling, but it's a good example of how risky the whole enterprise was. They could very easily have all been shipwrecked. Think about the fate of the Spanish Armada, which was destroyed by a storm. And fleets being destroyed by storms is a leitmotif in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle.
It's something that goes down through English history. There are multiple fleets that are destroyed en route to England, or English fleets that are destroyed en route to other sources.
And crossing the Channel in the fall is not a sure thing.
October is not the best month to do.
No.
On September 29th, Duke William's fleet arrived off the Sussex coast in the southeast of England at Pevensey and occupied the port of Hastings, where they immediately built a makeshift castle.
Which I've always found interesting. Hastings was one of King Alfred the Great's burghs, one of his fortified towns, which he built as part of a strategic defensive system against Viking attacks. King Athelred had refurbished defenses along England's southern coastline, But in 1066, after 50 years of peace, Hastings apparently was undefended. None of the sources record any resistance to the occupation of the town. That in itself is really interesting.
And here we get William's next stroke of luck. A strategic error by his opponent, or at least some people think so. King Harald heard of these events and immediately rushed south again to confront William. Big mistake, at least according to some historians, who say that he should have waited to gather more of the soldiers he had previously dismissed from service. Others have argued that Harold's forces were large enough to face William, and instead, his real strategic error was in risking a battle with the Normans at all. Harald could have simply hemmed them in on the coast until they ran out of supplies.
Which would have been standard military procedure in this period. As I've made clear in previous episodes, battles were very rare in the 11th century and in the High Middle Ages generally. Military doctrine taught that good generals focused on ravaging and sieges. Battles were simply too chancy, especially given the possibility of a commander's death, since the culture obliged commanders to fight from the front. As in chess, the death of a king in battle meant checkmate. That was, in fact, how Duke William had waged war throughout his military career to this point, and it would be how he waged war after the Battle of Hastings. That both William and Harald were willing to chance a battle is in itself exceptional. Harold's motivation may have been a combination of military calculation and personal economy. William had encamped in Sussex, where the bulk of Harold's estates lay, and was provisioning his troops by, and I love the term, living off the land, which means by foraging and pillaging and ravaging. So, the longer Harald delayed, the greater the destruction to Harold's personal estate and to his commended men, whom Harald was obligated to defend.
So this is a real hit to his prestige.
It's a tremendous hit to his prestige. The military calculation was he had just defeated Hardrada by moving quickly and surprising him. Why couldn't he repeat against William the Bastard when it worked against a more formidable military commander, Hardrada? William's decision to risk battle was based on different calculations. England lacked the castles and fortified towns of Normandy. Either William engaged Harald, or he'd be forced to retreat across the Channel. The latter itself would have been chancy in mid-October. Besides, William was fighting under a papal banner, and he was fighting against an oathbreaker. William had every reason to believe that God would grant him victory. I'm not sure we can solve the question of whether Harald was wise or foolish to fight William at Hastings, because we know what he didn't know. We know he was going to lose the battle. But he had just staked all at Stamford Bridge and he had won, so from his perspective, he was simply expecting to repeat his previous success. So there we are, Harald and William poised to fight for England. On Saturday, October 14, 1066, the Battle of Hastings decided the future course of English history. Harald made a forced march south with the survivors of Stamford Bridge, arrived at London, waited a few days for additional local levies to join him, and then took the offensive, marching south along the Roman road from London to Hastings. On the 13th of October, Harald encamped for the night on Calbic Hill, about 8 miles north of the town of Hastings. William's mounted scouts reported to the Duke Harold's position. William recalled the troops that were out foraging, ordered his men to arm themselves, while he himself took mass performed by his half-brother Odo, Bishop of Bayeux. William must have been anxious. According to William of Poitiers, in his haste to arm himself, he put on his hauberk backwards. Anyone else, Poitiers comments, would have been terrified, but the Duke laughed this off as pure chance rather than taking it as a sinister omen, end quote. Poitiers writes that William believed that Harald intended to surprise him at Hastings in a nocturnal attack. Instead, the Duke would turn the tables and surprise Harald. Harald also had advanced scouts, and when he learned that William was marching to meet him, he ordered his men to occupy a nearby ridge and prepare for battle. No, the Battle of Hastings was not fought at Hastings. It took place along the old Roman road about 6 miles north of the town. Today, the town that has grown up around the abbey that William ordered built on the battle site to thank God for the victory is simply called Battle. In 1066, it apparently did not have a name. The Worcester recension of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says that Harald drew up his forces at the Grey Apple Tree, which must have been famous in its day, but is long gone. As the Battle of Battle sounds silly, we'll continue to refer to it as the Battle of Hastings. Okay, back to the story. Harold's order to deploy along the ridge was tactically sound, as the enemy would have to fight uphill. I don't think that Harald actually expected William to leave his fortified stronghold at Hastings to meet his forces, but when he received news of William's approach, Harald drew up the English army into the classic Anglo-Saxon defensive formation, a shield wall. This is exactly what it sounds like, a wall of shields formed by soldiers pressed in a tight formation with their shields overlapping, much like the ancient Greek hoplite phalanx. It was essentially a field fortification made up of men. That's how it looked to the Anglo-Norman historian Henry of Huntingdon, who used the phrase quasi-castellum, like a castle, to describe the English formation. This was a sound tactic. A shield wall on an elevated position was notoriously hard to break. All Harold really had to do was hold the shield wall in the face of Norman attack, and he would win simply by not losing.
Duke William's task was much more challenging. He had to break the shield wall. In order to do this, he drew up his forces in the classic 3 battles or divisions. He himself commanded the center, while he put his Breton troops under their Count Alan on the left flank. On the right, there were soldiers from among his French allies. Now, these soldiers were all foot soldiers. William was not sending his cavalry in right away. He was keeping them in reserve, because it isn't all that effective usually to have cavalry charge uphill.
Yeah.
William wanted to break the shield wall first before sending in the cavalry. Cavalry are traditionally a kind of a mop-up sort of unit.
And many, many years ago, many decades ago, R. Allen Brown, who was a great historian of the Norman Conquest and especially of Norman castles, Allen Brown wanted to prove that it was possible to have a mounted charge up the hill at the battlefield. From my conversations with Professor Brown, I suspect that he also was releasing his inner historical reenactor. A Norman supporter to the core, Brown once told me that he would have gladly fought side by side with Duke William at Hastings. This was at the first annual meeting of the Battle Conference for Anglo-Norman Studies, held in Battle in July of 1981. I wasn't there, but I was laughingly told all about this by several colleagues who were. Brown, as the organizer of the conference, set up a practical demonstration of how easily it would have been for Norman knights to have charged up the hill. He and Ian Pearce, a medieval armorer, yes, there are craftsmen who specialize in making medieval armor and medieval weapons, both of them experienced horsemen, put on full Norman armor and up the hill. I say tried because halfway up the horses refused. So Brown and Pierce tried again, and this time Brown's horse not only refused but galloped back down the hill, almost crashing into a fence. Undeterred, Brown and Pierce tried a third time at a more measured pace, and this time they succeeded getting to the top of the ridge and announced that this is how the Normans did it. The BBC dutifully only showed footage of the successful quote-unquote charge. This is not to doubt that Norman cavalry actually did engage the English on the ridge. Brown and Pierce were good horsemen, but Norman knights were horsemen from childhood and rode war horses that were trained to obey their commands. But it does underscore the challenge that an unbroken line of disciplined infantry on top of a hill presented to cavalry.
Well, I think that gives you a sense of how chancy something like this might be.
Yeah. So
they want to break the shield wall. They want to go with the infantry first, but the infantry makes very little headway against the English initially.
And that's because the English keep on raining down on them various sorts of missiles. They throw their spears. Now, they didn't seem to have that many archers, and archery wasn't apparently an Anglo-Saxon thing.
Which is ironic.
Yeah, isn't that? Yeah, given what's going to later happen, yes. The Normans, on the other hand, were having trouble bringing their archers to bear. They couldn't get the right angle to be able to get much damage. Either the arrows would hit the English shield wall, or they would shoot right past the English army and land behind them. Or the English would manage to hold their shields over their heads at the right angle to repel the falling arrows. So William decided he had to send the cavalry in after all. At first, the horsemen had no more success than the foot soldiers had. The English shield wall stubbornly held, and it must be said that the English Royal Guard, the housecarls, were a formidable obstacle. They fought with two-handed axes that were more than capable simply of cutting off a horse's head or hamstringing a horse. Faced with this sort of treatment, it's not surprising that the Norman cavalry retreated.
And at this moment, the battle took a dramatic turn. The cry went out among the Norman soldiers that Duke William had been killed. Now, this would have been a disaster for the Norman forces, because the fate of armies whose leaders died on the field was almost always dire.
Think again of chess, and chess was the favorite board game of the medieval aristocracy.
When this happened, usually discipline collapsed completely, so William had to take swift action. He rode out in front of his army across the ranks with his helmet lifted to show his face, shouting defiance. This was obviously a huge gamble. If he's making it clear to his troops that he's alive, he's making it clear to the enemy where he is as well. He could really easily have been killed, but he knew that if he didn't make it clear he was still alive, the game was over anyway, and so this was enough to stem the rout. At the same time, the English got a little bit ahead of themselves. The English right pursued the fleeing Norman left, but once they had run downhill, they found themselves in disorder. They were vulnerable to a Norman counterattack.
And this exposes a key deficiency in Harold's army, its lack of cohesion and training. Battle discipline is not something that you can expect. It's something that comes from drill and training. And outside of Harold's housecarls, there really wasn't any. Pursuit of a fleeing enemy also meant a chance of acquiring individual spoils. If Harold's troops had been fighting an infantry force, the breaking of the shield wall to pursue a fleeing enemy would have made sense. Against a cavalry force that could regroup, it didn't.
Many of the pursuing English were surrounded and cut down by the Norman cavalry. So here we have another piece of luck for William, a tactical error by his opponent. And he didn't waste the opportunity. This incident seems to have given Duke William, a man who could clearly think on his feet, a brilliant idea. If a real retreat by the Normans had, in fact, turned out really well for them, what about a feigned retreat?
According to several Norman accounts of the battle, William had his forces perform this maneuver twice more in the battle, and it had the deliberate aim of drawing the English down to lower ground out of the protection of the shield wall where they could be more easily attacked. Now, the thing about it is it's not easy to do a feigned retreat. You can end up having a real retreat if you do it, and what that shows is that William's army was filled with horsemen who had trained together and practiced together so that they could actually pull this off.
You might even think that they had something we might call unit cohesion.
Yeah, and there is an argument for unit cohesion that's based upon the conquest, upon the Lord's retinues. And by this time, we're having the very beginnings of tournaments in which this type of group maneuver was actually done.
Mm-hmm.
So, this method resulted in a weakening of the shield wall. There were simply not enough soldiers left at the top of the hill to maintain the line. Now, it might seem odd that the English fell for this, but here I think it's important to stress the huge differences between medieval and modern warfare. Anglo-Saxon armies did not drill together. A shield wall is the perfect formation for an amateur army, as it requires no tactical maneuvering. What it does require is sufficient courage and discipline to stand firm in line, but much of that is provided, again as in the hoplite phalanx, simply by the depth of a multi-rank formation in which the press of battle makes it virtually impossible for those fighting in the front line to break ranks and run. William's army, with its combined tactical arms, presented the Duke with greater problems. It also lacked an established chain of command. And this underlies Duke William's concern when rumors spread that he had been killed in battle. Local command in both armies was based on individual lordship. There was simply no agreed-upon system for anyone else to take over command of the army if either Duke William or King Harald were killed. Orders were given on the battlefield, certainly, but that did not mean that they were going to be obeyed. Only a very charismatic leader, someone like William, had a good chance of being followed into obviously dangerous situations, and even then, the confusion of a medieval battlefield meant that soldiers often simply did what the man next to them was doing. In the case of Anglo-Saxon warfare, it was common for armies to break and run if the shield wall failed, or to exploit the opportunities for spoils if the enemy shield wall collapsed. The English furdmen at Hastings were not being uniquely incompetent when they fell for William's feigned retreat. If Duke William did order feigned retreats, as I believe he did, it showed that he was an acute battlefield general who could instantly analyze and exploit a perceived weakness of the enemy. But despite their losses, the English army continued to regroup, close ranks, and drive off repeated assaults on their lines. They did this for hours. As Jenny and my friend and colleague Stephen Morillo points out, and I highly recommend his edited collection of primary and secondary sources, The Battle of Hastings, published by that godsend for medievalists, the Boydell Press. As Morillo points out, Hastings was a very unusual battle. For one thing, it lasted from 9:30 a.m. until about 8 p.m. This is unheard of for a medieval battle, many of which were over in a matter of a couple of hours. William of Poitiers noted the unusual way the battle was fought. Quote, "There followed an unknown sort of battle, in which one side launched attacks and numerous maneuvers, while the other stood like rocks fixed to the ground." End quote. The length of the battle can be attributed in part to periods in which the Normans pulled back to rest and regroup before beginning another assault. It would not have been physically possible for men or horses to fight continuously for 10 or 11 hours. Morillo points out that Hastings was a close-run affair. For most of the day and early evening, one could not predict which side would end up victorious. And that brings me to a very important point, at least very important for medieval military historians. Hastings did not demonstrate the tactical superiority of shock cavalry over infantry. The most influential medieval military historian of the early 20th century, Sir Charles Oman, the Chichely Professor of Modern History at Oxford, believed that Hastings marked a watershed in Western European history, ushering in what he called the era of the supremacy of the feudal knight, which lasted until the 14th century, when English longbowmen mowed down French knights at Crécy and Poitiers, and Flemish foot soldiers crushed French knights in the Battle of the Golden Spurs. But not many historians of medieval warfare, certainly not many academic historians, accept Oman's conclusion that Hastings demonstrated the superiority of the mounted knight over infantry. In fact, the battle was hard fought and closely contested until the very end.
Indeed. The battle finally ended in a kind of reversal of what the Normans had feared at the beginning. King Harald was in fact killed, and his death precipitated the final rout, just as William had worried would be the case if he were thought to be dead. Remember the difficulties the Normans were having early in the battle, bringing their archers to bear? Well, they seem to have figured things out later on, because Harald was apparently eventually killed, Probably, though, he was not struck by an arrow in the eye.
Yeah.
But that is what people very quickly came to believe about Harold's death, because 2 generations after the battle, the story was told that William had specifically told his archers to aim their arrows high so that they would fall on the English soldiers from above. And this story sounds as if it was concocted to give William credit for a brilliant tactical maneuver, when we're probably just talking about a lucky accident. Lucky for the Normans, that is.
And the earliest source for the battle, the common Hastings die pro Elio, the song of the Battle of Hastings, Harold is actually struck down by 3 Norman barons.
I think it's pretty clear that nobody really knew how Harold met his end.
Yeah. Even in the Bayeux Tapestry, where it looks like there is an arrow, it may not actually be an arrow.
I was really disappointed when that turned out to be the case.
Yeah, so anyway, unlike Harold Godwinson, who had raced across England to meet his enemy, William took his time and prepared carefully to claim his prize in the wake of the Battle of Hastings. He spent the next 2 months maneuvering in a wide circle to the north and west from Hastings on its way to London. Of course, London was the big prize. As soon as the Battle of Hastings had been won, William set his sights on London, but he didn't want to head straight for the capital. He wanted to prepare the ground first, because a frontal assault on London was a very, very bad idea militarily. It was a walled city and could have held out for a long time. So William made a big arc to the northwest of London, harrying and burning as he went along. This had multiple purposes. By doing this, he provisioned his army. That is what we mean by living off the land. It was also meant to convince the English, who still resisted, that William meant business and it was unwise to continue that resistance. Finally, it isolated London from reinforcements. If you have burnt a lot of supplies in the area, immediately around the city, it's hard for the city to hang on in a siege. So that was the military thinking that went into William's actions.
But in addition to being a great military leader, William was also a very smart politician. At the same time as he was out taking care of the military side of the operation, he was putting out feelers to prominent English leaders, both noblemen and churchmen, to see if they might be willing to come over to his side. One by one, the English leaders did this, and I think it's because they began to see an inevitability about William's conquest, and they didn't manage to unite against him. Even Archbishop Stigand, that questionable Archbishop of Canterbury that we talked about earlier, was one of the leaders to offer his allegiance.
And it's finally time to bring on stage the 4th claimant to the English throne, because he represents one of William the Conqueror's biggest lucky breaks. I'm talking about a man named Edgar Atheling, and he had by far the best genealogical claim to the throne of England in 1066. Atheling is an Old English term for a noble with royal blood. The best translation for how it was used in 1066 is probably prince. And Edgar was called a prince because he was the grandson of Edmund the Ironside and the great-grandson of Athelred the Unready by his first marriage.
Edgar strikes me as one of the most amazing survivors in English history. Every time you think there is no way Edgar can get out of this mess, he does, simply because he is not impressive enough to kill. I'm sorry, I'm very hard on him.
Yeah.
We have to back up for a second to the
let's be fair. He's a kid at this time.
Well, he's an adolescent.
Okay.
Right? So other people of his age would have actually taken a more prominent public role. There are certainly examples of people who would have. I mean, William the Conqueror, at the same age, was out there kicking tail.
Okay, but again, to push back a little, as weird as it might sound, and I'm sure you're going to talk about this, Edgar was born and raised in Hungary. He lacked the political connections with the English magnates that someone of his bloodline might have been expected to have. Wait a minute. His dad brought him to England in 1057 when he would have been just 5 years old. So by 1066, he had already been residing in King Edward's court for 9 years. Well, that defense isn't going to work. Okay, Jenny, I give up. Okay, go ahead.
All right. Okay. So we have to back up for a second to the time of the Danish invasions in the early 11th century. When Edmund Ironside died in 1016 and left Knut in control of England, he had a young family, including a son named Edward, who was spirited away into exile on the continent and wound up in Hungary, of all places.
Yeah.
Little Prince Edward grew to manhood, married, and produced 3 children, a boy Edgar and 2 girls, Margaret and Christina. Then, in the 1050s, all of a sudden, a messenger arrived from the court of Edward the Confessor in England, asking Edward, the son of Edmund Ironside, to come to England. So he came, and it seemed that Edward the Confessor was getting old and knew he wasn't going to have any children, so he was trying to find somebody who represented the legitimate line of the Wessex dynasty, and that would be Edward from Hungary.
Yes.
But when Edward finally arrived in England, the king had changed his mind and refused to see him, and shortly thereafter the newly returned Edward the Exile died. But his 3 children were still around, including the boy Edgar. Now, this boy is unquestionably the closest in line to the throne. So why, in January of 1066, did nobody think of making him king? And it is my contention that it is because he was a doofus, as he proved time and time again in his long, long life. Because as long as the English have any other options, they go with it. But after King Harald Godwinson was killed at the Battle of Hastings,
along with his brothers Leofwin and Gurth,
the English Council of Advisors, at least the ones still around after Hastings, finally offered the throne to Edgar Atheling. But when it was clear that William had been able to cut off support for London, Edgar submitted to William. Edgar, as he proved throughout his life, was mostly interested in surviving.
And Edgar became a close friend of William's eldest son, Robert.
As I like to call them, Dumb and Dumber.
They went off on the First Crusade together.
They did. Now, I think it was a great stroke of luck for William that Edgar didn't have the stomach for a fight.
Yeah.
So a few days before Christmas, 1066, William of Normandy was able to enter the English capital peacefully.
He was crowned in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, and just like Harold Godwinson, William avoided being consecrated by Stigand. He got the Archbishop of York to do it instead. You couldn't be too careful about the validity of the consecration. Of course, what ended up happening was when there was the acclamation for his consecration, the Normans thought that it was the signs of an uprising, and there was a massacre of some of the people outside of the cathedral.
And they set fire to a lot of the surrounding buildings. And the reason that the Norman soldiers thought that there was something weird going on is because the acclamation was given in 2 languages. They were actually including the Anglo-Saxons. You can say it in English, that's great. But this sounded very menacing to the Normans. They didn't know what they were saying.
It's not a good way to begin your raid, but...
Yes, the multicultural England had a long way to go.
So now William was well and truly King of England. He had put aside the name William the Bastard, and he had now become William the Conqueror. He had put himself in the position to be lucky.
Now, the honeymoon period, such as it was, didn't last, and William had to spend the next 5 years fighting off various rebellions in England, plus an invasion by another Scandinavian claimant, Sweyn Estrithson of Denmark.
Harald Hardrada's rival, and now his heir.
Sweyn received support from the Northumbrians, so William was facing both an invasion and a rebellion. His response was the so-called Harrying of the North, an expedition of ravishing so devastating that, to judge by Doomsday Book, Yorkshire hadn't fully recovered from it economically 20 years later. He dealt with the Danes in a tried-and-true fashion, though. He paid them to go home.
And that is called paying the Dane Guild. And we proved it again and again, that if once you have paid him the Dane Guild, you'll never get rid of the Dane.
But with apologies to Rudyard Kipling, in this case, They did go home. And here is William being lucky again. He is lucky that Sweyn of Denmark was such a lazy, greedy scoundrel. And this mattered a great deal for the future of England, because it meant that England would look south to France, and not north to Scandinavia. There's a lot more to the story of how William consolidated his rule over England, but I think you get the idea. He knew when to be brutal, harrying of the north, and when to pay bribes, pay off the Danes. And for most of his life, he seems to have been able to make the most of the lucky breaks that came his way. Political instability in England? Check. Strategic and tactical errors by his opponents, some of whom were conveniently venal and or feckless? Check. Knowing which way the wind blows? Check. But of course his luck ran out eventually in 1087, and he and his wife are buried in Caen at the twin churches that they founded there, in expiation for the sin of having gotten married to each other.
Yes, I love it.
They were too closely related. If you are fortunate enough to go to Normandy, you can visit their tombs and marvel at the career of William the Lucky Bastard.
And with that, I think we've come to the end of this episode. I'd like to thank Jenny again for joining me in our exploration of one of the most truly momentous events in English history.
Whether or not the Norman Conquest was a good thing or a bad thing, coming and doing this episode with you has been a good thing.
Thank you very much. Until next time, bye for now.